When a young nurse is hired to care for a millionaire in a vegetative state, she walks into a house filled with hostility, especially from his wife, who wants her gone. But she refuses to be pushed away. Defying medical norms, she introduces bold, unconventional treatments, never expecting the shocking outcome years later. What really happened? Stay tuned for this gripping revelation, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling stories. The road to Ravenswood Manor stretched long and winding, flanked by towering oaks whose branches curled like skeletal fingers against the grey sky. Rain drizzled steadily, painting streaks on the windows of Sarah Whitmore's compact sedan as she drove through the misty countryside. The estate had been described to her as grand, though as it emerged from the shroud of fog, it looked more like a relic of another time, a looming, ivy-clad structure that had weathered decades of secrets within its stone walls. Sarah parked near the front entrance, gripping the steering wheel for a moment longer than necessary. She had worked in hospitals before, cared for patients in sterile white rooms filled with the beeping of monitors, but this was different. This was personal, tucked away from the world in a place where the air felt thick with history. With a deep breath, she pulled the hood of her coat over her head and stepped out into the rain, her boots crunching against the gravel. The door creaked open before she had a chance to knock. A man in a neatly pressed suit stood before her, his posture upright and formal, his salt and pepper hair slicked back in a way that suggested meticulous precision. His eyes, though kind, held a quiet observance as they scanned her face. "Miss Whitmore," he greeted, his voice smooth with an air of practiced politeness. "Welcome to Ravenswood Manor. I am James Holloway, the butler. I trust your journey was not too unpleasant?" Sarah smiled, though she sensed there was little room for pleasantries here. A bit of rain never hurt anyone. James nodded approvingly before stepping aside, allowing her to enter. The inside of the manor was as imposing as the exterior, a cavernous space with vaulted ceilings and walls lined with oil paintings of stoic-looking ancestors. A grand staircase curved elegantly toward the second floor, its polished mahogany railings reflecting the golden glow of the chandeliers above. The scent of aged books and faint traces of lavender lingered in the air, mingling with the low hum of the storm outside. "Mrs. Sterling is expecting you in the study," James informed her as he guided her down a dimly lit hallway. "She requested your presence immediately upon arrival." Sarah's grip tightened on her bag. She had read about Vivian Sterling in the papers before. The wife of Jonathan Sterling, a once powerful business magnate now trapped in a comatose state. Their marriage had been the subject of whispers long before his accident, and while the outside world had painted Vivian as the devoted, grieving wife, Sarah suspected reality would be far less romantic. James knocked on a set of double doors before pushing them open, revealing a lavish study bathed in the glow of a crackling fireplace. Vivian sat behind a sleek ebony desk, clad in a silk burgundy dress that fit her like a second skin. Her beauty was undeniable. Cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, lips painted a deep shade of red, and eyes that held an unreadable expression. She barely looked up from the stack of papers in front of her as she gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Sarah obeyed, adjusting her damp coat as she took a seat opposite the woman who now controlled her employment. Vivian finally lifted her gaze, studying Sarah with an intensity that sent a flicker of unease through her. "You come highly recommended, Miss Whitmore," she began, her voice smooth as silk yet devoid of warmth. "I expect professionalism and discretion in equal measure. I assume you understand the nature of the situation?" Sarah met her gaze evenly. "Your husband has been in a coma for nearly a year following the accident. My role is to provide care and ensure his condition is monitored closely." Vivian's lips twitched, though it was unclear whether it was amusement or irritation. "Yes, well. Don't get any foolish ideas about miracles, Miss Whitmore. The doctors have assured me there is no hope for recovery. Your job is to maintain him, nothing more." Sarah fought the urge to bristle at the cold dismissal of a man who had once been the heart of this home. "With all due respect, Mrs. Sterling, I believe in treating patients with dignity, not just maintenance." Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. "And that is precisely why you were hired. Do not mistake my realism for cruelty, Miss Whitmore. I simply refuse to entertain false hope." A tense silence settled between them before Vivian stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "James will show you to your quarters. You may begin your duties immediately. And, Miss Whitmore?" Sarah paused at the doorway. "Stay out of what does not concern you." James led Sarah up the grand staircase and down another long corridor before stopping in front of a door. He pushed it open, revealing a modest yet elegant room prepared for her stay. The four-poster bed was dressed in crisp linens, and a single window overlooked the fog-laden grounds. A wooden dresser and a small writing desk completed the space. "I must apologize for Mrs. Sterling's manner," James said as he set her suitcase down. "She has grown accustomed to solitude." Sarah offered a small smile. "I can handle it." James hesitated before nodding. "Mr. Sterling is in the East Wing. I can take you to him now, if you'd like." Sarah squared her shoulders. "Yes. Please." They moved through the hushed corridors, the manor heavy with an air of melancholia. As they reached the East Wing, James pushed open a set of doors leading into a dimly lit bedroom. There, lying in a massive canopy bed, was Jonathan Sterling. His once powerful frame had withered, his skin pale against the sheets. Machines beeped softly beside him, tracking the slow, steady rhythm of a heart still beating despite all odds. His dark hair was streaked with silver, his jawline still strong but devoid of the life it had once carried. Sarah stepped forward, heart pounding as she took in the man before her. A man frozen in time, locked away from the world in a state of endless silence. "Mr. Sterling," she murmured, fingers curling at her sides. "I'm Sarah Whitmore. And I won't give up on you." From the doorway, James watched silently. The storm outside raged on, but within the walls of Ravenswood Manor, something had shifted. Sarah had arrived. And the fight for Jonathan Sterling's life had begun. Sarah Whitmore walked through the dimly lit hallways of Ravenswood Manor, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound against the polished marble floors. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as if time itself had come to a halt the day Jonathan Sterling had slipped into his coma. It was a stark contrast to the warmth and vitality she imagined once filled these rooms. After her unsettling introduction to Vivian Sterling and the rigid house rules that had been set, Sarah had no doubt that she was not truly welcome here. But she wasn't the type to give up easily, especially when a life hung in the balance. Jonathan was not just a patient to her. He was a man with a past, with emotions, with a soul still locked away behind the stillness of his body. And if there was even the slightest chance of reaching him, she intended to find it. Sarah moved toward the large study that James, the butler, had discreetly pointed out to her earlier. It was one of the few rooms Vivian had all but abandoned after Jonathan's accident, which made it the perfect place for Sarah to begin her search. Pushing open the heavy oak door, she stepped inside and was immediately greeted by the scent of old books and lingering pipe smoke. The room had been left untouched, frozen in time with papers still stacked on the desk, an empty glass resting on the side table, and an intricately carved chess set awaiting its next move. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books lining the shelves. Classics, philosophy, a collection of historical accounts. But what caught her attention was a photo frame half buried beneath a pile of documents. Lifting it carefully, she found herself staring at a picture of Jonathan, standing tall and proud beside a magnificent black stallion, his smile genuine and full of life. Beside him stood a younger woman, Vivian. But the contrast between their expressions was telling. While Jonathan looked free, happy, Vivian's smile seemed forced, her body slightly turned away as if she were already retreating. Sarah set the frame down, her mind whirling. Had their marriage been an unhappy one even before the accident? Was that why Vivian seemed so indifferent toward his recovery? She pushed the thought aside for now. If she wanted to help Jonathan, she needed to focus on what had made him truly come alive. She searched further, scanning the room for anything that might serve as a bridge between Jonathan and his lost self. Her eyes landed on a dusty gramophone in the corner, a stack of records neatly arranged beside it. Curiosity piqued, she picked up one of the records, Chopin. Something stirred within her. "I see you found something of interest," a deep voice murmured from behind her. Sarah turned sharply, placing a hand over her heart as she exhaled in relief. "James, you startled me." "My apologies," he said, stepping into the room. "But I must say, I am quite pleased that you have taken an interest in Mr. Sterling beyond his medical condition. Most do not." Sarah hesitated before speaking. "I believe that true healing goes beyond medicine. If I can remind him of who he was, perhaps I can reach something inside of him." She gestured toward the record. "Did he listen to these often?" James nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Every evening, without fail." Chopin was his favorite, though he had quite the collection. Music was his escape from the pressures of business, a way to remind himself of beauty in the world. Sarah considered this, then carefully set the record aside. "And the horse? The one in the photo with him?" "Ah, Solstice." James' eyes softened. Jonathan raised him from a foal. They were inseparable. Riding was one of his greatest joys. Sarah could almost see it, the wind rushing through Jonathan's hair as he galloped through the sprawling fields, his laughter carrying through the air. It was a far cry from the silent, motionless man she had met earlier that day. "And Dante?" Sarah asked. "I heard he had a Russian blue cat." James' expression darkened slightly. "Dante was a special companion to him. After the accident, Mrs. Sterling insisted he be removed from the house. She claimed the cat served no purpose here anymore." Sarah frowned, feeling a tightness in her chest. "But Jonathan adored him." James hesitated before nodding. "Indeed. He was one of the few things that truly brought him comfort." A plan was already forming in Sarah's mind. If the doctors and Vivian had given up hope, then she would take a different approach. She would bring back the scents, the sounds, the touch of the life Jonathan had once known. Perhaps it was wishful thinking, but something deep inside her told her she was right. "James," she said, her voice firm, "I need your help." He studied her for a long moment, then inclined his head slightly. "What do you need, Miss Whitmore?" Sarah smiled. "First, I need to get Dante back. And then, we bring music back into this house." As she spoke the words, a surge of determination coursed through her veins. She had only just arrived, but she knew one thing for certain: Jonathan Sterling was not gone. He was waiting, and she would do whatever it took to bring him back. Sarah Whitmore wasted no time implementing her plan. The following morning, she retrieved the Chopin record she had found and brought it to Jonathan Sterling's room. As she placed the vinyl on the gramophone, a soft crackle filled the silence before the first notes of Nocturne in E-flat major drifted into the air. She glanced at Jonathan. His body remained still, but she had read enough about coma patients to know that external stimuli could trigger subconscious responses. The human mind, even in a dormant state, was still aware on some level. James entered quietly, carrying a tray of breakfast for Sarah. "Has he responded yet?" he asked in a hushed voice. Sarah sighed, shaking her head. "Not yet. But I believe he will. Music meant something to him. It's worth a try?" She pulled a chair beside Jonathan's bed and began talking to him, introducing herself properly despite knowing he might not hear. "Jonathan, it's Sarah Whitmore. I'm your nurse. But I'm also here to be more than that. I want to help you find your way back." She watched closely, hoping for a flicker of movement. As the music played on, she noticed something, a faint twitch in his fingers. It was brief, barely perceptible, but enough to make her heart race. "James, did you see that?" she asked, her voice breathless with excitement. James leaned in, eyes narrowing. His fingers moved. "Just for a second." Sarah nodded eagerly. "It's a sign. He's still in there." Over the next few days, she continued the music therapy. Each morning, she selected a different record from his collection: Chopin, Beethoven, Debussy. With every session, she spoke to him, describing the music, the outside world, the life that was still waiting for him. And with each day, the signs grew stronger. His fingers twitched more frequently, his breathing sometimes shifted when a particular piece played. But Sarah wanted to push further. One evening, after ensuring that Vivian was occupied elsewhere, she and James carried out their next step in the plan, bringing Dante back to Ravenswood Manor. The moment the Russian blue cat was placed on Jonathan's bed, Sarah held her breath. Dante, seemingly sensing something, cautiously stepped forward and curled up near Jonathan's arm. Then, for the first time since she had arrived, Sarah saw it, a true, undeniable response. Jonathan's fingers twitched, this time reaching, however slightly, toward the familiar presence. His breathing deepened, and a soft sound, almost like a sigh, escaped his lips. James let out a low gasp. "Miss Whitmore, this is remarkable." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. He knows. He knows Dante is here. She placed a gentle hand on Jonathan's. "We're going to bring you back, Jonathan. No matter what it takes." It was the first true sign of life, and Sarah knew this was only the beginning. Jonathan Sterling's room had become a sanctuary of careful hope. Sarah had seen the way his body reacted to the music, how his fingers twitched at familiar melodies. But it was the presence of Dante, his beloved Russian blue cat, that had triggered the most significant response yet. Sarah knew she had to build on this breakthrough. That morning, she arrived at Jonathan's bedside earlier than usual. James had discreetly prepared everything she needed: a bowl of fresh water for Dante, a soft blanket placed beside Jonathan so the cat could comfortably curl up near him. She bent over the bed, gently placing her hand over Jonathan's. "Good morning, Jonathan. It's another beautiful day outside. I have a feeling today is going to be special." Dante, perched on the bed, let out a soft purr as he rubbed his head against Jonathan's unmoving arm. Sarah watched with bated breath, hoping for another sign, another flicker of life within him. James stood by the doorway, ever the silent observer. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low and measured. "What if we tried something more?" Sarah turned to him, intrigued. "More?" James stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. "We've seen his responses to music and Dante. But there is one place that meant more to him than anything else: his equestrian club. The stables, the horses, the scent of fresh hay. Perhaps taking him there might trigger something deeper." Sarah's heart pounded at the idea. "You think moving him outside the house will help?" James nodded. "It's a risk, of course. But if you truly believe he's still in there, we have to do more than keep him in this bed. We must remind him of who he was." Sarah mulled over the thought. It was unconventional, risky even, but deep down, she knew James was right. Jonathan needed more than passive stimulation. He needed to be immersed in the world he once loved. The only problem was Vivian. Later that evening, Sarah carefully broached the subject with her. "Mrs. Sterling, I'd like to discuss a new approach for Jonathan." Vivian barely looked up from her evening tea, her cold gaze fixated on the fire. "Another one of your experiments, Miss Whitmore." Sarah kept her voice even. "It's more than that. I believe a trip to the equestrian club where he used to train Solstice might help awaken something inside him." Vivian scoffed. "You want to drag a comatose man to a stable? That's absurd." Sarah squared her shoulders. "It's no more absurd than assuming he'll never wake up. We've already seen responses, his fingers twitching, his breathing changing. If there's even the slightest chance, shouldn't we take it?" Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what if it doesn't work? What if you're wrong?" Sarah met her gaze. "Then at least we tried." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, with a resigned sigh, Vivian set her cup down. "Fine. But if anything happens to him, it's on you." Sarah barely concealed her relief. "I'll make all the arrangements." The next morning, James and Sarah carefully helped Jonathan into a specially arranged transport vehicle. Dante sat on Sarah's lap, watching over his owner with keen, intelligent eyes. As the car pulled away from Ravenswood Manor, Sarah could only hope they were making the right choice. As they approached the equestrian club, the scent of horses and freshly turned soil filled the air. The rhythmic sounds of hooves against the ground echoed in the distance. Sarah turned to Jonathan, observing his face closely. Then it happened. His fingers moved again, this time more deliberately. His lips parted, and though no words came, Sarah saw it in his eyes. Recognition. He knew this place. James inhaled sharply. "Did you see that?" Sarah's hands trembled. He remembers. They were on the verge of something monumental. And Sarah knew she couldn't stop now. Jonathan Sterling's visit to the equestrian club had sparked something undeniable. Sarah had seen the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the way his fingers moved with purpose. But while she was overjoyed, she could sense the undercurrents of tension growing in Ravenswood Manor, particularly with Vivian. That evening, as Sarah stepped into the manor's vast sitting room, she found Vivian already waiting for her. The fire crackled low, casting flickering shadows along the carved wooden walls. In her hand, Vivian swirled a glass of red wine, her gaze cold and calculating. "You overstepped," Vivian said without preamble. Sarah stiffened but kept her voice calm. "I did what I believed was right for Jonathan." Vivian let out a hollow laugh. "What you believed was right." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You're a nurse, Miss Whitmore, not a miracle worker. You don't get to make decisions about my husband's life." Sarah met her gaze evenly. "I understand your frustration, but I saw something today." Jonathan reacted. "He knew that place. His body is waking up. Shouldn't we do everything we can to help him?" Vivian's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. "You're naive," she muttered. "Hope is a dangerous thing, Miss Whitmore. And you're giving it to him, giving it to me, when you have no guarantee of where this leads." Sarah took a deep breath, choosing her next words carefully. "I know it's terrifying. The thought that he might come back, but not the way you remember him. But isn't that better than leaving him trapped in silence forever?" Vivian's expression flickered with something unreadable. Fear, perhaps. But before she could respond, James entered the room. "Mrs. Sterling," he said politely, glancing at Sarah before focusing on his employer. "Mr. Sterling is showing signs of increased responsiveness. His vital signs have improved since returning from the stables." Vivian's face remained impassive, but Sarah noticed the way her lips parted slightly, as if caught between disbelief and longing. Still, she quickly masked it. "Thank you, James," she said coolly. "That will be all?" James hesitated but inclined his head and left. Sarah turned back to Vivian, her voice softer now. "He's fighting, Mrs. Sterling. Whether you want to admit it or not, Jonathan is trying to come back to you." Vivian looked down into her wine glass, her expression unreadable. "And what happens if he does?" she whispered, more to herself than to Sarah. Sarah had no answer for that. The next day, Sarah focused entirely on Jonathan's care, blocking out the tension with Vivian as best she could. She spent hours at his bedside, continuing with the music therapy, allowing Dante to curl up next to him, speaking to him as if he could hear her. And then, late in the afternoon, the biggest breakthrough yet happened. As she was adjusting his pillows, she felt it. Jonathan's fingers brushing lightly against her wrist. Sarah froze, barely daring to breathe. "Jonathan," she whispered, searching his face. His eyelids fluttered slightly. A groggy sound, barely more than a whisper, escaped his lips. "Sarah." Her heart slammed against her ribs. He had said her name. Tears welled in her eyes as she gripped his hand. "Jonathan, can you hear me?" His fingers tightened around hers, ever so slightly. A weak but deliberate grasp. Sarah's breath hitched, and she bolted from the room, calling for James. Within moments, the butler and a stunned-looking Vivian were at the doorway. "What is it?" Vivian asked, her voice sharp. Sarah stepped aside, her voice trembling with emotion. "He spoke?" Vivian's expression faltered. "No, that's not possible." Sarah turned back to Jonathan, her heart pounding. "Jonathan, say something." His lips moved again, this time forming a word with more clarity. Vian. Vivian gasped, stepping forward, her hands shaking as she reached for his face. "Jonathan?" His eyes struggled to open, but there was no mistaking it. He was waking up. The silence that had surrounded him for so long was finally breaking. And nothing at Ravenswood Manor would ever be the same again. Jonathan Sterling had spoken. His voice had been weak, barely more than a whisper, but it had broken through the silence that had loomed over Ravenswood Manor for so long. The moment had been nothing short of miraculous, and yet, Sarah knew it was just the beginning. Now came the hardest part, helping him fight his way back. The morning air was thick with tension as Sarah entered Jonathan's room. He was still weak, his body frail from months of inactivity, but his eyes followed her with a flicker of awareness. The breakthrough had changed everything. "Good morning, Jonathan," Sarah said softly, setting a tray beside his bed. "How are you feeling today?" Jonathan's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. His fingers twitched weakly against the blanket. His body was still struggling to catch up with his mind, but Sarah could see it in his expression. He was there. He was fighting. Vivian's heels clicked against the wooden floor as she entered, her face unreadable. "What now?" she asked, arms crossed. "You expect him to be walking by next week?" Sarah suppressed a sigh. The woman was impossible. "No," she replied evenly. "But he's responding, and that means we need to push forward." Vivian's gaze flickered toward her husband. There was something vulnerable in her expression, something Sarah hadn't seen before. "And what do you propose?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before making her next move. "I want to take him outside." Vivian's eyes snapped back to her, the vulnerability gone, replaced by icy resistance. "Absolutely not. He needs more than this room," Sarah argued. "He needs sunlight, fresh air. Keeping him locked away in this house will only slow his progress." Vivian's jaw tightened. "You are asking me to risk his life?" Sarah took a step forward. "No, I'm asking you to help him live." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. James, who had entered quietly, finally broke the tension. "Mrs. Sterling, perhaps Miss Whitmore has a point?" Vivian's eyes darted to the butler. James rarely offered opinions, and his siding with Sarah was significant. She looked back at Jonathan, at the way his fingers weakly clutched the blanket as if grasping for something just out of reach. Finally, she exhaled sharply. 1 hour. And if anything happens, I'll take full responsibility, Sarah finished, relief washing over her. With James' help, Sarah carefully moved Jonathan into a wheelchair. His body was weak, and every motion required patience, but she could feel the determination radiating from him. The moment they wheeled him onto the terrace, a soft breeze brushed against his face. His eyes fluttered shut as if savoring the sensation. For the first time in months, Jonathan Sterling was outside. Sarah knelt beside him. "Breathe it in, Jonathan. Feel the sun on your skin." His fingers twitched again, more deliberately this time. His lips parted, and though the words were barely audible, Sarah heard them. "Feels good." Tears stung her eyes, but she held them back. This was just the beginning. Vivian stood nearby, arms still crossed, but Sarah noticed the way her gaze softened as she watched her husband react. Something was changing in her, too. Jonathan Sterling was coming back. And whether Vivian admitted it or not, she wanted to believe it. The sunlight had done something to Jonathan Sterling. The following morning, Sarah walked into his room to find his eyes open, more alert than before. Though his body remained weak, there was a shift, a presence that hadn't been there before. She took it as a victory, however small. "Good morning, Jonathan," she greeted, placing a fresh set of linens on the bedside table. His gaze flickered toward her, and his lips moved slightly, though no words emerged. Still, Sarah smiled. "That's all right. We'll take this one step at a time." James entered moments later, carrying a small wooden box. He placed it on the nightstand and met Sarah's curious gaze. "I thought you might find this useful," he said quietly. "It belonged to Mr. Sterling." Sarah lifted the lid carefully and found a collection of letters, some tied together with a silk ribbon. She picked up the topmost one and glanced at the elegant handwriting. "Jonathan, you once told me that love is a decision we make every day. I wish I had made better choices. I wish I had fought for you the way you fought for everything else in life. Perhaps one day, I will. Vivian." Sarah's heart clenched as she looked over at Jonathan, his frail body lying in silence. Had Vivian loved him once in a way that mattered? She traced the edges of the paper, lost in thought. This letter was old, the ink slightly faded. It was written before the accident, before the distance between them had grown into something impenetrable. James spoke softly, as if reading her mind. "Mrs. Sterling was not always the woman you see today." Sarah nodded, slipping the letter back into the box. She had suspected as much, but now she had proof that beneath the layers of indifference, regret lingered. Perhaps Vivian was not as unreachable as she seemed. Later that evening, Sarah found Vivian standing by the terrace, staring out at the gardens. The wind ruffled her silk blouse, but she didn't seem to notice. "I found the letters," Sarah said gently, stepping beside her. Vivian didn't flinch. "Did you?" "They were beautiful," Sarah continued. "Honest." A bitter laugh escaped Vivian's lips. "Honesty means nothing when it comes too late." Sarah hesitated. "It's not too late. He's still here, Vivian." Vivian finally turned, her expression guarded. "What do you expect me to do, Miss Whitmore? Pretend the past never happened?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "But maybe you should stop punishing yourself for it." Vivian's eyes softened, just for a moment, before she straightened. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." She turned and walked away, but Sarah had seen it, that flicker of something buried deep beneath years of detachment. The past had not been forgotten. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was not beyond redemption. The revelation of the letters had shifted something between Sarah and Vivian. Though the older woman remained guarded, there was an undeniable change in the air. For the first time since Sarah had arrived at Ravenswood Manor, she sensed that Vivian was beginning to question the walls she had built around herself. But there was still more to be done, more ways to reach Jonathan. Sarah found James in the hallway early the next morning. He was always awake before anyone else, his quiet efficiency making him a permanent fixture in the household's rhythm. "I need your help," Sarah said in a hushed tone. "Jonathan needs more than just memories and letters. He needs to be reminded of who he was." James nodded knowingly. "The stables?" Sarah smiled. "Exactly. Jonathan had once been an avid equestrian. He had spent countless hours training at the Ravenswood Equestrian Club with his prized stallion, Solstice. If there was anything that might draw him further from the depths of his silence, it was the familiar sights and sounds of the stables. But Sarah knew that Vivian wouldn't approve, at least not yet. And so, she and James worked in quiet coordination, arranging for Jonathan to be taken to the stables in secret. When the time came, they carefully wheeled him out to the waiting car. The journey was smooth, the silence in the vehicle filled only by the occasional glance Sarah threw toward Jonathan. His gaze was unfocused, but there was something different in his expression, an anticipation, perhaps. As they arrived at the stables, the scent of hay and fresh earth filled the air. Sarah stepped out first, taking in the vast expanse of land, the gentle nickering of horses, the soft rustling of trees in the distance. She turned to Jonathan, watching him closely as James carefully maneuvered his wheelchair onto the stable grounds. The effect was immediate. Jonathan's fingers twitched against the armrest, and his chest rose with a deep, deliberate breath. His eyes, though still distant, seemed to register his surroundings in a way they hadn't before. Sarah crouched beside him, keeping her voice soft. "Jonathan, we're here. Do you remember this place?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, as if summoned by some unspoken bond, Solstice emerged from one of the nearby paddocks. The magnificent stallion stood tall, his dark coat gleaming in the sunlight. He took a few cautious steps toward them, his ears twitching as he studied the man before him. Sarah held her breath as she reached for Jonathan's hand, gently guiding it forward. Jonathan's fingers moved. It was slow, almost imperceptible, but there it was, his hand, reaching out toward Solstice. James exhaled sharply beside her. "Miss Whitmore?" Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I see it." And then, in a voice so faint it could barely be heard, Jonathan spoke. "Solstice." The single word sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. It was proof, Undeniable proof that Jonathan Sterling was still in there, fighting his way back. Tears blurred her vision as she turned to James, who looked just as stunned. They had done it. They had found another key to unlocking the man buried beneath months of silence. But what they hadn't expected was the presence of another figure watching from a distance, Vivian. Her face was unreadable, but Sarah knew. She had seen what had just happened. And for the first time, it wasn't resistance in her eyes. It was hope. The sight of Jonathan reaching for Solstice had shaken something in Vivian. She had spent months convincing herself that her husband was gone, that the man she had once known had disappeared into the void of his coma. But now, as she stood at the edge of the stables, watching him murmur the name of his beloved stallion, a realization settled over her. Jonathan was still here. And perhaps, so was she. Sarah turned toward her, measuring the expression on Vivian's face. It was no longer cold and indifferent. Instead, there was hesitation, uncertainty, and something dangerously close to longing. "He remembers," Sarah said softly, as if afraid to break the fragile moment. Vivian swallowed hard, her gaze never leaving her husband. "I thought this was pointless," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "I thought he was too far gone." Sarah stepped closer. "He's coming back, Vivian. You just have to decide if you're ready to be part of it." Vivian turned sharply to face her. "You think I don't want that?" she snapped, though there was no real bite in her words. "You think I enjoy watching him like this, not knowing if he'll ever be the man I married again?" Sarah didn't flinch. "I think you're afraid." Vivian let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Of course, I'm afraid." Her voice wavered slightly. "What if he wakes up and he hates me for giving up on him?" Sarah hesitated before speaking. "Then don't give up now." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of horses and the rustling wind. Finally, Vivian let out a deep, shuddering breath. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah smiled gently. "Talk to him." Vivian nodded once, then slowly stepped forward. Sarah and James watched as she approached Jonathan, who still sat in the wheelchair, his gaze locked on Solstice. The stallion remained still, sensing the delicate moment unfolding before him. Vivian knelt beside her husband, hesitating before reaching for his hand. "Jonathan," she said softly. His fingers twitched slightly. His lips parted as if forming her name, though no sound came. A tear slipped down Vivian's cheek. "I'm here," she whispered. "And I'm sorry." Jonathan's hand tightened, ever so slightly, around hers. Sarah exhaled, relief washing over her. This was the moment she had been waiting for, not just for Jonathan, but for Vivian as well. The walls were breaking down, and for the first time, it felt as though the Sterlings had a chance to rebuild what they had lost. James stepped beside Sarah, watching quietly. "I never thought I'd see the day," he murmured. Sarah smiled. "Neither did I." But as she watched the way Vivian clung to Jonathan's hand, she knew this was only the beginning. The moment Jonathan tightened his grip around Vivian's hand, Sarah knew the battle had truly begun. The body may have been slow to catch up, but the mind, his mind, was waking up, fighting its way back into the world. And with that realization came the daunting task ahead. The days that followed were grueling. Physical therapy sessions became the new routine, stretching Jonathan's weakened muscles, forcing his body to remember how to move. Every step was painstaking, every session a test of patience and willpower. Sarah had seen it before. The agony of a body trying to reclaim strength it had lost, the frustration in eyes that once commanded power but now held nothing but exhaustion. But she also saw something else, determination. Again, Jonathan rasped, his voice still weak but firm, as Sarah and the physical therapist supported him through another round of assisted leg lifts. His forehead was slick with sweat, his fingers trembling from the exertion, but he refused to stop. Vivian watched from the doorway, silent but present. She never interfered, never spoke up to object, but Sarah knew she was afraid of the pain, afraid of the possibility of failure. More than anything, afraid of the change this recovery would bring. The man waking up was not the same man she had resigned herself to losing. "Take a break," Sarah said gently as Jonathan sagged back against his wheelchair, his breath labored. He shook his head. "Not yet." Sarah knelt beside him, meeting his gaze. "Jonathan, you're doing incredible, but pushing too hard too fast can set you back." His jaw clenched. "I've been gone long enough." Vivian took a slow step forward. "Sarah's right," she said, her voice softer than before. "This isn't just about coming back. It's about coming back strong." Jonathan's eyes flickered toward her. For a moment, something unreadable passed between them. Then, with a slow exhale, he gave a small nod. "All right." Progress was slow, but it was progress. Each day brought new victories, a steadier grasp, a more coherent sentence, a firmer push against the therapist's guidance. It was an uphill battle, but Jonathan fought it with a ferocity that left Sarah in awe. One afternoon, as she helped him into his wheelchair after a session, he looked up at her, his tired but determined expression catching her off guard. "Why?" Sarah blinked. "Why what? Why do you care so much?" His voice was rough, but there was no malice, only curiosity. She hesitated. How could she explain that it wasn't just about him anymore? That his fight, his will to live, had become a symbol of something greater to her? That she saw in him what she had seen in so many others? People who had been counted out too soon, people who just needed someone to believe in them? Instead, she smiled. "Because you're worth it?" Jonathan stared at her for a long moment before huffing out something that could have been amusement or disbelief. "You're stubborn?" Sarah chuckled. "So are you." In the background, Vivian watched, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But Sarah had seen it before, the slow thawing of ice that had encased a woman too afraid to hope. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe again. The road ahead was long, and there were still many battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, Ravenswood Manor no longer felt like a place of mourning. It felt like a place of possibility. Jonathan's recovery was no longer just about him. It had begun as a battle against his body's limits, but now, it was reshaping the dynamics of everyone around him. The house that once echoed with silence now hummed with life. Small victories were celebrated, his first unassisted movement, the day he managed to lift a fork to his mouth, the first time he said a full sentence without struggling. Sarah had seen recovery take many forms, but this was different. It wasn't just about the physical progress, it was about the people who stood by Jonathan's side. And at the center of it all was Vivian. At first, she had been a reluctant participant, watching from the sidelines as Jonathan clawed his way back to himself. But now, she was there every day, holding his hand during therapy, reading him the paper in the mornings, even learning from Sarah how to assist him with simple exercises. She was rediscovering the role she had long abandoned. One afternoon, Sarah arrived at the therapy room to find Jonathan and Vivian sitting together. A chessboard was set up between them, the pieces in mid-game. Jonathan's hand hovered over a knight, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I didn't think you played," Sarah remarked, stepping closer. Jonathan grunted. "Vivian does. She's been trying to beat me for years." Vivian smirked. "And today's the day it finally happens." Sarah watched as Jonathan made his move, and Vivian countered almost immediately. The air between them was different, lighter. There was something close to amusement in Jonathan's eyes, something akin to warmth in Vivian's expression. For the first time, they weren't just husband and wife tethered by duty. They were two people sharing a moment. Later that evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave for the night, she found herself stopped by Vivian at the doorway. "Miss Whitmore," Vivian began, her voice hesitant. Sarah turned. "Yes?" There was a pause before Vivian spoke again. "Thank you." Sarah tilted her head. "For what?" Vivian's eyes softened. "For bringing him back to me?" Sarah smiled. "I didn't do that." "He did?" Vivian shook her head slightly. "No. You gave him a reason to fight." It was an admission Sarah never thought she'd hear, and it made her chest tighten. "I think we all did," she said gently. Vivian nodded, and for the first time since Sarah had met her, she looked at peace. As Sarah left Ravenswood Manor that night, she realized something. Jonathan wasn't the only one who had healed. This house, this family, they had been broken for a long time. But now, piece by piece, they were putting themselves back together. And for Sarah, that was more than enough. Jonathan's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, but as he continued to regain his strength, a new challenge emerged, figuring out what came next. The life he once knew had changed, and so had he. Lying in bed for months, unable to move, had given him time to reflect. Now, as he took his first steps toward full independence, he knew he wanted to use his second chance for something meaningful. One morning, as Sarah helped Jonathan with his exercises, he turned to her, his expression contemplative. "I want to do something that matters," he said, gripping the parallel bars tightly as he practiced walking. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You already are. Look at how far you've come." He shook his head. "Not just for me. For others. I've been given a second chance, and I don't want to waste it." Sarah studied him for a moment, seeing the determination in his eyes. "What do you have in mind?" Jonathan exhaled, lowering himself onto a chair. "When I was in that coma, I wasn't entirely gone. I could hear things, feel things. But I was trapped, unable to respond. I wonder how many others are in that same position. People who are written off before they've had a real chance to fight." Sarah's heart clenched. She had seen too many patients left to languish, dismissed as hopeless cases. "You want to help them?" Jonathan nodded. "I want to create a foundation, somewhere people like me can get the care they need, the support they deserve. Too many families don't have the resources to help their loved ones recover. I want to change that." Sarah's lips curled into a smile. "That's an incredible idea." Vivian, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "And I want to help," she said softly. Jonathan looked up at her in surprise. "You do?" She nodded, clasping her hands together. "For a long time, I was lost. I let my fears and guilt dictate my actions, and I almost lost you because of it. But you're right. There are so many others who need what you were lucky enough to have. If we can give them that, then maybe everything we've been through will mean something." Jonathan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Then let's do it together." Over the next few weeks, plans for the Sterling Rehabilitation Foundation took shape. Sarah, Jonathan, and Vivian worked tirelessly, reaching out to specialists, securing funding, and gathering a team of experts who believed in their mission. James, ever the steadfast supporter, offered his assistance as well, managing logistics and using his connections to bring influential figures into the fold. One evening, as Sarah sat in Jonathan's study, finalizing the proposal, he glanced at her with an amused expression. "You know, you could stay, help run this with us." Sarah looked up, caught off guard. "Stay?" Jonathan nodded. "You've become a part of this family, Sarah. And this foundation, none of this would exist without you." Vivian, sitting nearby, gave a small smile. "He's right. We wouldn't have come this far without you." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. She had never truly belonged anywhere, always moving from one patient to the next. But here, in Ravenswood Manor, with these people who had fought so hard to rebuild their lives, she had found something she never expected: a home. She exhaled softly, then smiled. "All right. I'm in." Jonathan grinned. "Good. Because we have a lot of work to do." As the foundation's official launch neared, the house that had once been filled with sorrow now buzzed with excitement and purpose. The past no longer weighed them down, it had given them the strength to move forward. And for the first time in a long time, Ravenswood Manor felt like a place of hope. The launch of the Sterling Rehabilitation Foundation was only days away, but for Jonathan, the biggest milestone was yet to come: his first unassisted steps. His recovery had been grueling, each day pushing him further toward reclaiming the independence that had once defined him. Now, he stood on the precipice of a moment that would symbolize just how far he had come. That morning, as Sarah entered the therapy room, she found Jonathan already seated in his wheelchair, his expression set with quiet determination. Vivian was beside him, her hand resting lightly on the armrest. James stood nearby, ever watchful. "Today's the day," Jonathan said, his voice strong despite the apprehension in his eyes. Sarah nodded, suppressing the lump in her throat. "Yes, it is." He had been practicing with support, walking small distances with parallel bars or Sarah's assistance, but this was different. Today, he would try on his own. Vivian inhaled sharply as Jonathan gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, preparing to stand. Sarah knelt beside him, offering a steadying presence without intervening. "You can do this," she murmured. Jonathan exhaled slowly, then pushed himself upward. His legs trembled under his weight, his muscles straining against the effort, but he didn't falter. Slowly, painfully, he straightened, standing fully upright for the first time since the accident. A stunned silence filled the room. Then, cautiously, Jonathan took a step. Vivian gasped. James stiffened, his usually composed face betraying a flicker of emotion. Sarah held her breath. One step turned into two, then three. The fourth step sent a tremor through Jonathan's legs, and he wavered. Sarah instinctively reached out, but he raised a hand, stopping her. "I've got it," he said, his voice laced with effort but resolute. And he did. With another deep breath, he steadied himself and took another step forward. Tears welled in Vivian's eyes. "Jonathan." He turned to her, the ghost of a smile on his lips. "I told you I wasn't done yet." Sarah let out a breathless laugh, pride swelling in her chest. This was it, the proof of everything they had fought for, the undeniable testament to Jonathan's willpower. He was no longer just surviving, he was living again. Later that evening, as the household celebrated his breakthrough, Jonathan pulled Sarah aside. "I never got the chance to say it properly," he admitted. "Thank you, Sarah. For everything." She smiled, shaking her head. "I didn't do this, Jonathan." "You did?" He considered her words before nodding. "Maybe. But I wouldn't have fought this hard if you hadn't believed in me." As the night carried on, laughter and conversation filled Ravenswood Manor. The weight that had once hung over the estate had lifted, replaced with something lighter, freer. The past no longer held them captive. And with Jonathan's first steps, a new journey had begun. The day of the Sterling Rehabilitation Foundation's grand opening had arrived. What once seemed like an impossible dream was now a reality. The sprawling estate of Ravenswood Manor, which had once been cloaked in sorrow, now buzzed with energy and purpose. The main hall had been transformed into a reception area filled with doctors, therapists, former patients, and supporters eager to witness the unveiling of something truly special. Jonathan stood at the heart of it all, a symbol of perseverance and hope. He was no longer the man who had lain motionless in his bed, trapped between life and oblivion. He was standing tall, greeting guests with a steady handshake, walking short distances with the help of a cane, and engaging in conversations that carried weight and meaning. Sarah watched him from the sidelines, pride swelling in her chest. He had done it. They all had. The journey had been long, painful, and filled with moments of doubt, but here they were, on the other side of the storm. Vivian stood by Jonathan's side, poised and elegant, but softer than before. There was no longer a wall between her and the man she had nearly lost. As the speeches began, Jonathan took the stage, gripping the podium with steady hands. The room quieted, all eyes fixed on him. "I spent months in silence," he began, his voice strong and clear. "I was lost, trapped in a place where I could hear the world but could not reach it. And then, someone refused to let me stay there. Someone believed that I was still fighting, even when I wasn't sure I was." His eyes found Sarah's, and for a moment, everything else faded. "This foundation is not just about my recovery. It's about every person who has been told they will never walk again, never speak again, never be who they once were. It's about proving that we are more than just a diagnosis. We are more than the limitations placed upon us." Applause erupted through the hall, and Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. This was more than a speech. This was a promise, a mission, a purpose that extended beyond just one man's struggle. After the event, as the guests mingled and celebrated, Jonathan found Sarah standing by the garden terrace, gazing at the horizon. He walked toward her, his step steady but deliberate. "You're not thinking of leaving, are you?" he asked, his voice laced with something close to amusement. Sarah turned to him with a soft smile. "I go where I'm needed." Jonathan nodded. "And where are you needed now?" She exhaled, glancing back at the estate, at the people who had become like family to her. "I think I already know." Jonathan grinned. "Good. Because I wasn't planning on letting you go so easily." Vivian approached then, her expression warmer than Sarah had ever seen. "Jonathan's right. You belong here, Sarah." Sarah chuckled. "I suppose I do." As the evening drew to a close, Jonathan took one final look at the home that had once been a place of grief and solitude. Now, it was filled with light, laughter, and the promise of new beginnings. Sarah stood beside him, no longer just his nurse, but his friend, his confidant, and a part of something far greater than she had ever imagined. The past had finally been laid to rest, and the future stretched wide before them, waiting to be embraced. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan Sterling felt truly, undeniably alive.